wage and the prospect of prize money awarded for the capture of an enemy ship or city. There was also the excitement of adventure. Additionally, no seafaring knowledge was required, probably useful when the recruits came from a landlocked county. Notably, as there was no increase in their numbers during periods when the Navy was particularly active, such as during the Crimean War, patriotic fervour is unlikely to have figured highly in their decision-making process. Most enlisted at Chippenham, although a few also joined up at Bath or Salisbury. Recruitment parties were, I've discovered, sent out from the naval barracks at Portsmouth into Wiltshire during the century, and consequently most Bremhill boys were enlisted into the division based at Portsmouth. Posters would announce the arrival of the recruitment party on a particular day, and boys and the young men from the locality would be invited to apply in person to a military officer on a particular day. An officer such as Captain Dad or Lieutenant Bagnall, who signed up a few of our Bremhill boys. Although the officers were looking for men of a particular age and general fitness, they seem to have been pretty flexible in the recruits that they took from Bremhill. Samuel Alexander was only 16 when he joined up in 1810. He was small, only 5'1", although he did grow an inch by the following year. He was described as a fair-skinned boy, or a fair-faced boy, with hazel eyes and brown hair. He passed the physical, which is likely to have been only very superficial. He was shortly after discharged on medical grounds before the age of 20. He was suffering from what was described as rheumatism. He returned home and died at the age of only 23. So I think it's likely he probably had some underlying medical condition at the time he was signed up. For some, the reality of the Navy obviously came as an immediate shock. One in this category was Jacob Fry. He was 21 when he joined up on the 17th of December, 1855. He lasted less than a week, running away 2 days before Christmas. What punishment he received, I've not been able to establish. But by this time, physical correction had become unacceptable anyway. He was returned to the naval barracks, actually at Woolwich, on the 29th of December, and he was discharged from his military service 5 years later, described as an invalid. However, his ailments don't seem to have been life-changing. He returned back home to Bremhill, moved back in with his father, resumed his life as a labourer, and later married and was still working well into his 70s, and he died at the ripe old age of 83. Once training was completed, the ultimate fulfillment of a Marine was to become part of a detachment on board a naval vessel. Meshach Alexander, a very unusual name I think for locals, was a 16-year-old labourer when he joined up just after Christmas in 1809. In 1810, he was transferred from Portsmouth to HMS Franchise. The Franchise was a French frigate which had been captured by the British and taken into the Royal Navy. The 16-gun vessel had a crew of about 200 and likely a detachment of around 30 Marines. She served extensively in the Caribbean and had proved most adept at catching the vessels of privateers, and pirates, essentially. In 1810, she had a new captain, John Allen. Early that year, and I think before Meshach was on board, she had collided with a transport ship in the Mediterranean, almost cutting her in two. The transport ship, the John and Jane, had been sunk with a significant loss of life. By May, Meshach sailed with Franchise for Newfoundland in Canada. Conditions on board ship were likely to have been at the very least uncomfortable. A Marine officer described his berth on a similar ship during the period as, and I quote, a place between two guns about 7 feet long and 4 foot wide and divided from some 100 hammocks by a little canvas or an old sail. There is no light but for a candle, nor no air but of what is unavoidably very foul. On board Franchise, apart from taking watches and providing guard duty, Marines like Meshach were usually given labour-intensive tasks such as pumping water or turning the capstan. Tragically, by October, Meshach had died, aged just 17. There are no details provided, and I can find no evidence that she'd been engaged in any enemy action. I assume, therefore, that Meshach had died of natural causes. In the close quarters of naval vessels, disease spread quickly, and indeed, at this time, it seems that, despite medical attendants being on board, more Marines were likely to die of disease than they were from enemy action. 2 other Bremhill boys who served in the Marines also died, but not on board ship, rather at the Royal Navy's hospital at Portsmouth. In both cases, I can't connect it to enemy action. One was George Bear, who before his hospital admission had been assigned to the Royal Navy's flagship, the 120-gunned HMS Britannia, which had for 2 more months before his death been just simply moored up in the harbour at Portsmouth. One of the worst crimes a Marine could commit was desertion. It does, however, seem to have been very commonplace. Richard Hawkins from Bremhill gave the Marines 10 years of his life before he deserted in 1841. He doesn't seem to have been caught, and nor did he return to the Navy voluntarily, and I assumed he lived out the rest of his life in hiding. I'm not sure if he actually returned to Bremhill, as there are a few who share his name in the immediate area. By contrast, Jacob Fry, mentioned already, had been caught but didn't appear to have been harshly cheated. However, for one of the Bremhill recruits, William Provis, in the 1830s, the outcome was very different. William was a 23-year-old labourer when he joined up the Marines in Bath in 1831. Like many recruits, his father was a labourer. William was tall, dark-haired, with grey eyes and a fair complexion, according to his documentation. He was serving with the 8th Company of the Marines at Woolwich Barracks when he fled in July 1836. He made his way back to Wiltshire. In December that year, he was committed for trial in the county on the oath of one John Groom of Devizes, who'd reported him into the authorities. Rather than face trial in Wiltshire, he seems to have been handed back to the Navy, and in 1837 he was dismissed from the Marines after being punished. William had received, and I can't quite believe this, the extraordinary punishment of being branded with the letter D, possibly under his armpit on his left side. It is likely that Henry Hawkins, who was mentioned in the abstract for this piece, had also deserted or committed another similar major vice, such as cowardice. Punishments were even more severe during Henry's time, and I think it's likely that he was flogged before he was discharged in Bermuda. The alternative to desertion, if a Marine wished to leave the service, was to purchase his way out. And this feat was actually managed by a couple of Bremhill recruits. One called George Freeth, who joined up in 1832. He paid £20, which was a hefty sum, to be released from his contract 9 years later. He returned to Bremhill, married a local girl, Sarah Cole, and resumed a life as a labourer. He raised a large family. About a third of those who joined the Marines locally were actually discharged from the service on medical grounds before they completed their contracts. Some of them I've already mentioned. Another was Isaac Godwin, a Bremhill shoemaker who served for 7 years during the Napoleonic Wars. Isaac was discharged for what was described as general debility, aged 30. He returned home, and again he seems to have married and resumed his life, dying at the age of 55 in 1839. A few local recruits, of course, were in it for the long haul and did very well. These included Luke Vines, who joined the Marines at aged 18 in 1835. Luke served throughout the Crimean War before being discharged at 40, possibly when the service was being contracted post-war. He received a naval pension. At the time, such an annuity was not automatically given, and it was probably issued to Luke because he had an excellent service record. While his service is not well documented, and I can't be sure of what ships he served on, the documentation is good for one Henry Woodward, who was born in Bremhill in 1854. Henry's father was a Chalcot bootmaker who'd not been married to his mother at the time he was born, although they did eventually marry. Henry joined the Royal Navy in 1869 at 14, when, with the consent of his father, he seems to have been signed up until the age of 28. By the time he was 16, he was on board the huge iron-hulled steam frigate HMS Inconstant, one of a crew of 600. Firstly part of the Channel Squadron and then the detached squadron, he served in Gibraltar and at various Scandinavian ports. In 1872, Inconstant was temporarily moved into the reserve fleet, and Henry, who was now an ordinary seaman, was assigned to the naval flagship, the HMS Duke of York at Portsmouth. In 1876, he was on board the HMS Unicorn in Dundee, and between 1877 and 1879, he was on Inconstant's sister ship, HMS Raleigh, over the period that she served in the Mediterranean, including being based at the brand new acquisition of the British of Cyprus. Henry acquainted himself very well and became a petty officer second class. In 1880, he was stationed on the brand new gun vessel HMS Rambler and became a petty officer first class, or a boatswain, a foreman for the ship's deck crew. He was then assigned to HMS Boadicea and Thalia, and in 1882 he signed on for another 10 years. It seems in the first 13 years of his service, the only wound he'd sustained was to his left forefinger. His next ship was HMS Northampton, a massive armoured cruiser with a complement of 600 crew and weighing in over 7,000 tons. She was the Navy's flagship in North America and the West Indies, and Henry served for the next 4 years in America and the West Indies and thereabouts. Back on dry land and probably on furlong due to 4 years at sea, he married Katie Hill in Salisbury in 1886. His last few years of service were on the royal yacht Osborne, taking the royal family on foreign trips and on jollies to and from Osborne House on the Isle of Wight. He retired to Portsmouth on a military pension. The last Bremhill boy I want to talk about was Alfred Tuck, another agricultural labourer who, this one however born at Spurt Hill. He enlisted in the Navy at 18 years in 1904. Alfred was 5'10", fresh-faced, with apparently a little scar on his left or above his left eye. By the time he joined his first ship the following year as a stoker, he was also sporting a significant tattoo on his right forearm, which is actually in his service record, it's described in great detail, but it was essentially the Union Jack and a bare-breasted woman. As a stoker, he was responsible for shoveling coal into the furnaces, both onshore and on board a succession of steamships, including the HMS Duncan, on whom he served in the Atlantic. In 1909, Alfred left the Navy by buying his way out of service. He returned to Wiltshire, married, and became a postman for Hillmartin. His discharge had been conditional on his joining the Royal Fleet Reserve. As a former recruit of good character who joined the reserve, he was paid an annual retainer and was prepared to be called up in an emergency. Unfortunately for Alfred, his life was overtaken by history. While on his annual Navy training in 1914, Britain declared war on Germany. He was immediately assigned to HMS Good Hope, and Alfred never saw home again. HMS Good Hope was the flagship of the 4th Cruiser Squadron. The squadron engaged a larger German fleet off the coast of Chile on the 1st of November 1914. Apparently, Good Hope charged the enemy ships who were ordered to concentrate their firepower at her as she was the flagship. On fire, she exploded in the darkness, apparently with the loss of all the crew, including Alfred Tuck. So that's my little synopsis of those Bremhill boys who joined up, and I really enjoyed researching those stories. They are so interesting. So I don't know if anyone has any questions or comments or thoughts.
Thank you, Louise. Fascinating, fascinating personal stories of a whole range of people. Did you come across anybody who sort of was had made good money, do you reckon, out of?
I didn't detect anyone had made a lot of prize money. Unfortunately, during the period where most of those recruits were active, the Navy doesn't appear to have been particularly active, or active in a way that would have allowed them to have a large payoff.
Right.
So.
Because you do hear of sort of huge estates being bought by
yeah, absolutely, and I'm sure that was part of the, that was part of the reason why you joined up on the potential of, some men, got hundreds of pounds or even larger sums.
I'm sure some of the bath houses, certainly if you believe you're Jane Austen, were built by well, pirates of one sort. Please unmute if you want to ask a question. Sarah, you better unmute everybody.
You're muted, David.
Hang on.
He's waving his hand. Yeah, hello, David. Just wait. We're going to unmute you.
I've asked him to unmute.
David, bottom left-hand corner.
Oh, there he goes.
Yeah.
David, this is most unusual that you're muted.
I just wanted to make a quick comment on Alfred Tuck. When I was researching the World War I soldiers, I was fascinated by Alfred's work. He worked at Hillmartin as a postmaster. But most important, talking to David Stevens, Dr. David Stevens, about HMS Good Hope, and David Stevens worked for a little while in it's gone now, Stanley. And apparently in Stanley Church is a very, very large memorial slab to the crew of HMS Good Hope, and Alfred Tuck's name is on that.
Really?
The Falklands, Stanley in the Falklands, not Stanley here.
Oh, that's an important clarification.
I find that Alfred Tuck's story so sad. They had a memorial service to him in Hillmartin, and apparently lots of posties from the area were there, commiserating with his widow and child. So
It's interesting that David Stevens actually clearly remembered seeing the memorial in Stanley.
Really, it would be interesting to see it.
Well, it's actually in the main church in Port Stanley in the Falklands Islands.
There's probably photographs of it. It would be interesting to see that.
No, I just thought people would like to know.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting.
Can I, whilst we're unmuted, actually also ask a question, which may not be so directly related to what you've said, but this is to do with the stained glass in Foxham Parish Church. And that stained glass is supposed to come from Bremhill at some time. But at the bottom of the stained glass, this is above the altar, there's a dedication to some sailors who were drowned, or a sailor, no, I think it's sailors who were drowned. Do you know anything about sailors who were drowned?
No, I don't. Do you know their names?
I have written them down, but I haven't got them with me at the moment. But if you go into Foxham Parish Church, or somebody who lives near Foxham, I think there are a few people, go in, but it's right at the bottom, and because the stained glass window came, so we believe, from Bremhill into Foxham, it doesn't fit very well, so you have to, it's right down the bottom, and it's not very easy to read.
That's really interesting. I will check that out. I think that I know that a window was moved there, wasn't it? It wasn't that old a window either. It was from the 1850s or something.
I cannot remember.
Butterfield moved it.
Yeah, Butterfield moved
Yeah.
it. But I can't remember the date of these sailors who drowned, and it always struck me as odd that sailors from this area, as you say.
Yeah, I'll definitely check that out. Thank you very much for that. I hadn't known that. Anybody else?
We should try and get hold of some of those images, Louise.
Yeah, it would be really good to.
And I like the sound of that tattoo as well. Pity we haven't got a picture of that. We can.
Yeah, I tried to search online to see if I could find anything similar, but I didn't. But it,
It's all some really interesting stuff anyway.
So I didn't hear you, Martin.
You must have found some interesting stuff looking for those sort of tattoos online.
Yeah, I didn't want to spend a few minutes, but yes, a lot comes up that's, not really appropriate.
Louise, it's an amazing amount of detail you've managed to get. I mean, things like birthmarks, are they in Navy records?
Only in the only time I saw it mentioned was for Alfred Tuck, and that was obviously a lot later. I have physical descriptions of the guys who enlisted. I presume it was recorded as part of their physical exam that they had to undergo.
Right.
So I have their height and what kind of complexion, the colour of their hair, but any other marks aren't noted, or at least on the examples that I saw.
Is there anything, Louise, that you'd like to throw out to the group as a sort of any areas for further research or investigation that you'd like to encourage?
Well, I certainly think that I think a lot could probably be done on Bremhill recruits, possibly in the 20th century, in the First and Second World War. It might be nice to have, quite a lot of that within the book, because I think there'd be a lot of interest. So if anyone has any thoughts on doing that, that would be good to hear.
You've certainly got a lot of knowledge on the First World War, haven't you?
But all the First World War ones that died have been documented. But it's always been my intention to look at all the rest that are on the board in Bremhill Church and other churches, just to see about them, because there's another 70 or 80 people on there. But it all takes time.
Yeah, I mean, the naval records seem to be pretty good. I mean, there's a lot more that, because I only had what was available online, but there seems to be an awful lot at the National Archives. I mean, it would have been interesting to go into ship's logs and things like that, which are sometimes available.
Well, the Royal Marines Museum will give you access to all the records if you actually go and visit.
Yeah, that's my problem that I had, because I'm sure I could have found out even more detail than I managed, was because I had to rely on what was available online.
David, was there a particular regiment that the people from the parish tended to enlist with?
Initially, in World War I, they went for the local regiment, the Wiltshires. But after the various massacres, they didn't put people in the local regiment. If that happened, and there was yet another disaster when they went over the top, it would be the entire village that would be dying. So they stopped doing the Powell's Battalion, and they would. So we, for instance, in Bremhill, had a guy that lived at number 40. I think his name was Ponting, and he was the first guy that went to a Scottish regiment. He became a gunner, and interestingly, he was always known as the Londoner because he was south of the. So they went into any regiment they were out of the country. So if they went over the top, the village didn't die.
God, that's hilarious.
Louise, you mentioned some people going to Canada.
Yes, yeah.
Was-
I'm not entirely sure the reason for that voyage.
I just wondered if there happened to be a sort of exodus on the turn of the century, 1900s, late 1800s, 1900s, early 1900s, to what would be new territories.
Yeah,
Moving to Canada for work or whatever.
yeah. I mean, this was actually back at the beginning of the previous century. So this was 1810, that voyage to Newfoundland. So yeah, we were still in the midst of a war with the French at that time. So it might have been to do with that.
It was terrible French.
If I may just make a comment there, Marion and myself have done a sort of world tour looking at relatives, because we had some that went to Canada, and we actually found out lots and lots about him. You saw about, I don't know, five generations ago, something like that. And there was an incentive to go to Canada because they were very worried that America was going to expand northwards. So the British government gave an incentive for people to go. And you were offered, believe this or not, 600 acres for £10 settlement fee after you'd built a house in a year's time. So there was it 6 months or a year? I can't remember now. You were given, at the turn of the century, our relatives,
Oh, the turn of the century.
and a bit earlier, but it was you got 600 acres for £10. So our guy, Sam, he had 600 acres in Saskatchewan, in the middle of the prairies, and a lot of the people thought this is a great deal, let's go. You were allowed to take, I can't remember the quantity, X tons of farming equipment with you, which was quite amazing.
Wow.
That's interesting. Two of the children of the vicar of Bremhill at the time, Edrub, both went to Canada.
Yes, they
Both
did.
settled in Canada.
Yes, they did. And if I remember correctly, one of them didn't make the farming and went into, I've forgotten which city it was it's a long while since I looked him up. But a lot of them didn't make the grade, and they sometimes, unfortunately, committed suicide, and sometimes they moved into a town or a city. And our relative, when his next 600 acres guy left, he bought the 600 acres. And just before I take all the time up, we went to see things, and on each corner of the road, they built a school or a church or a skating rink or something like that on the corner of, because effectively they were a mile by a mile by a mile. So we went, we were taken to the church where he was buried, and it was a hut, a wooden hut. And because we were going, the locals had had it repainted, and they had a service specially for us.
Wow.
That must be the reason for your halo.
And then Marilyn thought she'd better buy something while she was there, so she bought the local cookery book, and the next year's produce show, she entered the banana cake and won it. She told the people in the village, and it was headlines in the local newspaper about the Bremhill produce show. That's enough from me.
Thank you, David, for the broad-ranging contribution. Has anybody else got any other questions for Louise at this point?
Well, I'd like to butt in again and say, great job. I know how long all this takes, so well done, Louise.
Oh, thank you.
Excellent. Louise, thank you very much. And you may have noticed Rosalind's joined us, and she's going to be doing a talk for us in July. So we're going to give Louise a break in July and have Rosalind talking about how people made livings in the parish in times gone by. So we're looking forward to that. Louise, thank you very much, and we will keep communicating. Anybody, any other questions, any other points? Right, okay, thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Louise.
Thank you.
Thank you.